You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. Just in time for Christmas, we're back with a brand new MD Vickers tale today. It's been a while. Arthur Pentelow's Local. In typical Vickers fashion, we're off to a pub, where, inevitably, strangeness ensues. We hope you enjoy this one. Arthur Pentelow's Local by M.D. Vickers. Arthur Pentelow loved his local. It wasn't far from his bungalow, and it got him out of the house. He always enjoyed the gentle stroll there, if the weather was good, obviously, and the couple of pints in great company that followed. Dominoes was often played, less so darts, as the arthritis in his hands was pretty bad now. He liked to watch the men, and occasionally the ladies, shoot some pool. He'd been a keen player back in the day, but of course now his rather gnarled fingers were unable to wrap around the butt of a cue anymore. He always managed to get them around a pint glass, though, somehow. Where there was an intense will, there was always a way. He still liked to smoke, and was quite at ease standing in the pub's little porch with his cigarette as the sun went down. Some amazing skies to be seen. Made him quite reflective, and mortal somehow. And then one day, another landlord took over. No lease went up. One night Sheila Honeyford was there, and the next she'd been replaced by William Aspden. The transition was as quick as that, and that's when Arthur's thoughts on his beloved local began to change, and not for the better. It was a Friday night. Arthur was walking down to the Grey Man, breathing deeply, taking in the refreshing evening air. The time was just after 8. You could set your timepiece by Arthur. Always. Routine was part of his DNA. He wouldn't have it any other way. He passed a young woman pushing a buggy and nodded a greeting. She smiled back, showing immaculate white teeth. Turkey teeth. Arthur's next-door neighbour, Doreen, had taken a trip especially to get her smoke-ravaged tombstones perfected. He'd never understood that one bit. She was 72. He was approaching the proximity of the pub, the usual sounds drifting through the open door and carrying on the spring air. He wasn't a heavy drinker. He didn't want to follow the same path as his late brother Roger. 3, 4 pints tops, and the social element that went with it was all he required. He entered, feeling immediately relaxed and at ease. Then he remembered Sheila had gone, and his heart sank a little. He'd liked Sheila. Lovely lady, always plenty to say. This new fella, William, was something of an enigma. Maybe just needed time. Time indeed would tell. He ambled over to the bar and looked around. No sign of Aspden. He turned around to look behind him, and the second he turned back, the landlord was there, unsmiling, expectant. "Good grief, where did you spring from?" Arthur queried. Aspden remained silent, his mad Einstein frizzing out all around his head. His eyes were unsettlingly close together, and he had a large, hooked nose, and underneath it, a rampant moustache going every which way. He still said nothing. "Okay. A pint of bitter then, please." He indicated the pump of choice. Aspden poured. Arthur was getting irked with his demeanour. "What happened to Sheila?" he asked gruffly. "You seen her since she left?" "No idea," Aspden returned, and placed the pint in front of Arthur. Arthur reluctantly dug out his wallet and handed a note over, flexing his fingers after he did so. He received his change and voiced a cheers. Nothing. Letting out his breath in a weary sigh, Arthur turned and headed over to Billy Webb, who was sat at a table over near the toilets. His prostate demanded it. Billy was a large man, eternally jovial, with a bald head and rimless glasses. He also had the flattest ears Arthur had ever seen. "All right, Bill." Billy looked up from his phone, and his face lit up. "Arthur, how's it hanging? Limply, I'm guessing." Arthur guffawed and sat down opposite him. Well, that's a much better greeting than old Einstein over there. What the hell's up with him? Or is it just me? Billy placed his phone on the table, folding the wallet cover over it. No, pal, it ain't just you. He's very strange. Most antisocial landlord I've ever seen. Billy took a slurp of his pint, wiping foam off his top lip immediately after. I don't get him. He's just kind of appeared. And no one has heard from Sheila either. And where's Adele, the barmaid who started a few months ago? Arthur pondered. Of course, Adele. She wasn't here either. Lovely girl, friendly, polite. It was very peculiar. You know he's into black magic and all that bollocks, Aspden? Arthur looked at Billy. There was no humour on his face. Really? Although that wouldn't surprise me in the least, bloody weirdo. Billy returned. After closing, a few go upstairs with him. Rumours of a Ouija board, etc. All manner of creepy stuff. Not for me, all that shite. You don't know what you're messing with. Arthur took a gulp of his bitter. He placed the glass gently back on the mat. I don't like him at all. He gives off really weird vibes, and it's pissing me off because I love this pub. Billy nodded. Same here. He's hardly spoken 2 words to me. I've seen him chatting to others, though, the ones who go upstairs. He gestured to a few dotted around the pub. Arthur was about to voice more of his opinions when William Aspden suddenly appeared from the corridor leading down to the toilets. For a reason he couldn't explain, Arthur got the impression he hadn't actually used the toilets, but had been merely stood there listening. He hadn't even seen him go past them. He felt a creeping coldness in his stomach, filling up towards his chest. What if he had been listening? Arthur began retracing their conversation in his head. Had they said anything particularly nasty? He didn't think so. Certainly hoped not. Aspden walked outside, after helping himself to a drink, probably going for a smoke. Billy turned towards him after catching him out of the corner of his eye. Bloody hell, where did he come from? Arthur took a good gulp of his pint, his aching hand trembling a little. I have no idea. It's creepy the way he just appears from nowhere. Billy began to rise from his seat. Toilet time. Seemed to have gone longer than usual. He uttered a chortle and disappeared down the passage. Arthur drained his pint and walked over to the bar, taking his empty with him. Through the open door, he saw Aspden flick a cig butt onto the cobbles before coming back in. He almost seemed to sense when someone needed serving. Arthur asked for another pint. It was poured in silence once more. With foam oozing down the sides, Aspden handed it over and stared at Arthur wordlessly. Arthur paid. He was reminded suddenly of the film Duel, where the truck driver takes an intense dislike to a motorist for absolutely no reason and hunts him down. His arms broke out into goosebumps, and he walked back to his table. Billy still hadn't returned. Arthur sat back down and slid the box of dominoes towards him. See if Bill wants a game when he gets back. Time crawled on. 1/4 of an hour had gone by and no sign of him. Arthur began to feel the first tentacles of worry thread through his nervous system. Maybe he should go and check. What if he'd had a heart attack or a stroke? Arthur gave it 5 more long minutes before getting up and heading towards the gents. He pushed open the outer door attentively, then the main one. Familiar toilet odours assailed him. Bill? Billy? Nothing. All 3 cubicle doors were ajar. No one at the urinals. Bill! He shouted again, pushing open fully the cubicle doors, one after the other. Still nothing. Arthur began to feel very odd indeed just then. He consciously kick-started his breathing. The windows in here were narrow. One was open, but there was no way he could have gotten through. And why would he anyway? He looked around helplessly, splashed some cold water on his face. It was then he heard the outer door creak open. He quickly composed himself and pretended to care about his reflection in the mirror. A man came in and gave him a brief nod before lining up at the urinals. Arthur walked out, his imagination churning. He pondered in the corridor. He wouldn't be in the women's, surely. He heard the toilet flush in the men's, so he walked back to the empty table. He never saw Billy Webb again. The following day, Arthur was very anxious. He took a Valium. He sat down. He stood up and paced. He didn't even know where Billy lived. Only known him for a couple of months through the pub. He was surmising he was a local man, but that's all he had. His phone had still been on the table, so he'd taken it with him. He couldn't access it, though, as it required a passcode. He tried a few numbers at random with no success. How could someone just vanish like that? Arthur had stayed at his table for another hour before leaving, without getting another drink. Aspden had behaved normally, serving people, wiping tables, watching the TV. Arthur almost approached him several times to ask about Billy, but for some reason he couldn't bring himself to do it. He'd left about 10:30. A light drizzle was eddying, but he only had a short walk. He pulled up the collar of his coat, hands thrust into his pockets, deep in bewildered thought. And now here he was the day after, wondering what to do. Hopefully he'd be in tonight. Maybe he'd just walked past Arthur when his attention was diverted and gone home. But he'd have said goodbye. And he never left a pint unfinished. And his phone. It was too early for the pub. He didn't want to start that habit. Evenings only. He went to the library instead, which was somehow still surviving in an era of online books. He thought about hunting out some books and all this stuff Aspden was supposed to be into, but felt disinclined at the last moment. His thoughts were disturbed enough without adding to the mix. He eventually walked out empty-handed and nipped over to the supermarket for a few bits before heading back home. After his tea of corned beef ash, he got himself ready to go to the pub. Shave, splash of aftershave which stung slightly, comb on his thinning hair, change of shirt, shoes on, then a tentative popping of the head out to the front door to check the weather. It was overcast but dry. He stepped out and locked his front door. He breathed deeply, savouring the scent of blossom on the air. He had Bill's phone with him. It hadn't rung all day. No messages, nothing. Arthur did know that, like him, he lived on his own. The battery was running low. Hopefully he'd be giving it back to him tonight. He walked. For some reason it felt like the short route was taking longer tonight. He looked towards the pub. He didn't seem to be getting any nearer to it. "You're getting old," he told himself, which was undoubtedly true. But still, he ploughed on, and gradually, the grey man began to loom larger, until he at last arrived there and entered, breathing harshly. He was still out of breath when he reached the bar. To his surprise, Adele was there serving another customer. She looked over and smiled tentatively. When she'd finished serving, she came over. Arthur noticed she didn't seem herself somehow, apprehensive. She kept looking behind and to the side of her distractedly. You okay, love?" Arthur asked her, gradually beginning to breathe normally again. "Yeah, not bad," she returned, but Arthur thought she might not be exactly telling the truth. "Where's the landlord?" he ventured, and Adele visibly flinched slightly. "Checking the barrels, I think," she replied, and then asked him what he wanted. He told her, and she poured. "Hey, listen, has Billy Webb been in tonight?" Arthur had looked around and not seen him. He wasn't at his usual table. Adele knew him, so she'd obviously know if she'd seen him. "No, he hasn't," she returned, placing his pint in front of him. "It's strange, because he's normally in well before now, especially with it being Saturday." Arthur handed over his money, telling her to have one for herself. She thanked him and went over to the resident alcoholic, Gina Blackwood, who was leaning unsteadily on the bar and shouting for service. "Vodka, please," she caterwauled through smoke-ravaged vocal cords. Arthur walked away. Normally it was karaoke on a Saturday night, but not tonight. He sat down feeling very uneasy. He lifted out Bill's phone. It had finally died. Bill's cards were there in the wallet folder. "Where the fuck are you, pal?" Arthur whispered. He kept looking around the pub, feeling more desperate and hopeless as time wore on. He only saw Aspden once, emerging from the back with a cigarette preloaded between his lips as he went outside. He glanced over at the pool table area. A few young lads smacking balls around, laughing and joking with each other. He was suddenly reminded of a story he'd listened to on some YouTube channel about a weird pool table that ate someone. Christ, that popping into his head was certainly a reflection of his state of mind at the moment. He suddenly went to the bar and got himself a whiskey for Dutch courage. Chugging it down in one, he went outside without hesitation. He would confront Aspden, ask him what his problem was, and who the hell did he think he was anyway? Upon stepping out, Aspden was nowhere in sight. He looked all around, even going round to the back. No sign of him. What the hell was going on? The whiskey was burning his stomach. He went back inside. He didn't feel good. Not at all. "Arthur, you seen anything of Billy recently? Billy Webb?" It was Dave Valentine who'd shouted to him as he finished throwing his last dart at the board. "No, Dave, I haven't. No idea where he's gone. It's a bit weird." Dave took a swallow of lager. "Yeah, not like Bill at all. He's always in here. Hopefully he'll be back in soon." "Hopefully," Arthur returned, but not believing it in the slightest. "Hey, Dave, you don't know where he lives, do you?" Dave shook his head slowly. "Sorry, mate, I don't. I can ask around, though." Arthur nodded. "Yeah, that would be great. Cheers, Dave." Suddenly spurred on, he began to ask others had they seen Billy Webb out and about, and did they know his address. They all shook their heads. A fella, whose name temporarily eluded Arthur, said he thought he'd seen Billy in the local snooker club that afternoon, but quickly realised it had been someone else who bore a striking resemblance to him. Feeling utterly dismayed, he stepped back outside the pub and lit up. Dragging deeply, he thought again about Billy's phone wallet just lying there abandoned on the table. It was a warm evening, but he felt a shiver suddenly twist its way down his spinal cord. The next day he slept. He had bad dreams. His appetite wasn't there, but he ate what he could. He tried charging Billy's phone with his own charger. Although it fitted incorrectly, the phone inexplicably remained dead. The evening came round and he set off on his pub trek, dread now replacing the anticipation he used to feel. It was overcast again. He walked and walked. He felt light-headed. He looked up. The grey man looked like he was looking at it through binoculars the wrong way round. He wasn't getting any nearer, but a pub couldn't move. He gritted his teeth and ploughed on. Eventually he looked up again and found he was finally getting closer. His breathing was ragged, heart thudding. He approached the entrance and almost collapsed. Grabbing onto the doorframe, he drew glances from the concerned regulars. He breathlessly wheezed that he was okay. Someone went to the bar and got him a drink of water. He accepted it gratefully and chugged. "You okay, Arthur? Not run here, have you?" Arthur shook his head. Guess I'm not as fit as I used to be." He smiled shakily and sat down on a seat near the window. Slowly, he began to feel more like himself. He went to the bar cautiously. He couldn't see Adele, but Aspden was there in conversation with a bloke he knew was one of the cult crew. Aspden came over. Arthur asked for his usual. Same procedure. "You seen Billy Webb recently?" Arthur was struggling to control his anger. He described him to Aspden, who'd finished pouring the pint. The eerie landlord looked vague, slowly shaking his head. "No, not seen him." "Are you okay? You don't look too good." I'm fine," Arthur snarled and turned abruptly away, almost forgetting to pay. He went back to the window and sipped thoughtfully. He'd never felt more unnerved by events in his life. After getting another drink, he joined in a few games of dominoes, despite the shooting pains in his hands. Later, when he called it a night and set off home, it suddenly occurred to him that the walk back felt the same as it always had, but why did it now feel like it took far longer going the opposite way? Was he going crazy? He had no answers. None at all. He'd reached his house before realising that he had an unlit cigarette still dangling from his numb, dry lips. Monday came round, and Arthur had an idea. After a dinner of spaghetti bolognese, he didn't manage much, but a little. He rang up a local taxi firm and booked a cab for 8 o'clock. He stood at his window waiting until it pulled up. He left his bungalow and climbed into the front of the taxi. "Grey Man Pub, please." The driver nodded and silently pulled away. Roughly 20 seconds later, they'd arrived. The driver turned to Arthur with a smile. "Probably the shortest run I've ever done, my friend." He consulted his dash. "Just call it one round, mate." Arthur, feeling sick to his stomach, took £2 coins out instead and handed them over. "Thanks," he managed to get out before pushing open the door and stumbling onto the drizzle-drenched pavement. The taxi drove away. Arthur stood there, feeling outside of himself. He didn't want to go in. The local he had once loved, and he was terrified of going in. Where the fuck was Billy? Why was this happening? He stayed there for what seemed like forever, oblivious to the soaking he was being subjected to. Eventually reaching a decision in his mind, he decided he was in no state to socialize tonight. He trudged slowly back home as the rain came down even harder. Arthur had another fitful sleep. During his wakeful periods, he had decided on one thing. Today was going to be the day he was going to confront William Aspden head-on. He wanted answers. He wanted him to explain his behaviour. He wanted to know all about his so-called black magic. Looking at his face in the bathroom mirror, it seemed like he'd aged considerably in the last few days. He couldn't be bothered with a shave. Merely had a quick swill of mouthwash after urinating and ablutions, then swiftly got dressed and walked into his kitchen, where he made a very small bowl of porridge. He also did something that he never thought he'd do. He purchased a small bottle of whiskey to drink before his walk that night, to fortify him for the journey. He spent the afternoon trying to read and failing. He paced around his house, listened to the radio, watched daytime television even though he despised it. For his evening meal, he had a quick, somewhat soggy microwave lasagna. The time had crawled round to 7 p.m. He grabbed his bottle of whiskey and took a swig. It burned its way down to his stomach. After the third swig, he began to feel a little calmer. He pondered over whether to finish the bottle before he left, then decided against it. He would take it with him. He'd need it. He waited until his usual time before leaving the house. He was suitably fortified. Zipping up his jacket, he set off, prepared for anything. At first, he felt things were going okay. He seemed to be taking the usual amount of time to reach certain places. Then, he became aware of there being somewhat of an odyssey ahead of him. He felt like an explorer foraying into territory he knew was going to be arduous. Yet, on he walked. He took the whiskey out and had another gulp, some drizzling down his chin. He felt he was getting nowhere again. He dared to look up. The grey man was far, far away on the horizon. But how could this be? Arthur Pentelow had no answers, because there simply weren't any. All he could do was carry on walking and hope. He didn't pass anyone. It was like he was all alone in this living nightmare. His heart thudded and whammed. He drank more whiskey, desperately trying to swallow it as he breathed rapidly. It felt like he'd been walking for hours. Was this Aspden delaying the inevitable confrontation? He was beginning to feel tendrils of exhaustion creeping into his legs. They were a dead weight. He had to force them to move. No cars went past him, just an endless road. He didn't think he was going to make it, but he looked up and felt some hope. He seemed somehow a lot nearer. The pub glimmered like a mirage in a desert. He saw people stood outside having a smoke. He heard laughter. He felt invigorated and took a final swig of whiskey, throwing the empty bottle away from him. People turned at the sound of breaking glass. They saw this panting and gasping man drop onto all fours and still continue his journey. Several began to run over. Shouts, confusion. Someone started to pull him up. It was Billy, he was sure of it. An intense relief surged through him. He lifted his head with a colossal effort. But it wasn't Billy. He began to weep. "It's okay, mate. We've got you." Concerned voices from seemingly everywhere. "What's happened to him? Is he all right? Get him inside." Arthur suddenly found he was really struggling to take air in. His left arm emitted a sudden shooting pain far worse than his arthritis. His face was deathly pale. He sagged. Someone screamed, "He's having a heart attack! Get the defibrillator!" Someone else, panic-stricken, shouted back, "Where is it? It's not here." More chaotic confusion and shouting. "It's not on the wall!" Someone else yelled, "Run inside, see if it's in there." Every ounce of strength deserted Arthur. He collapsed bonelessly on top of one of his helpers. They aided him to the cobbled floor. Someone was attempting CPR. Someone else came running back out of the pub. "I can't find the landlord. How is he?" Arthur felt an excruciating squeezing sensation in his chest as it moved up and down with the pumping action. Voices came to him from down a long tunnel of blackness, voices that were fading fast. The last image he took away with him was Sheila reaching out a hand and gently caressing his bristled cheek, telling him that it was okay, everything was going to be okay. Then, eternal darkness. Inside the Grey Man, William Aspden was upstairs, stood in his room he used for his after-hours gatherings. The window was slightly open, and he could hear everything. There was a slight smile on his face as he stared at the defibrillator on the table in front of him. He'd have to move it back onto the wall outside soon. Someone had undoubtedly called an ambulance. People do strange things when in a panic. Miss things that are right in front of them, for instance. He supposed he'd better show his face. He'd been down in the cellar all along, of course, changing the barrels with his earpods in, listening to podcasts. Hadn't heard all the commotion. Such a tragic thing to happen, too. He'd make sure to take care of things at his end. He was the landlord, after all.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,